Hi everyone. What I want to talk about is the aspects of religion and how that affects your reading of a sacred text. This is generic in some ways. It can apply to religions around the world and other religions you might study, even when you look into other cultures. But you have to think about the fact that the Bible is a religious text. At the end of the day, before above and beyond anything else, it is a religious text. Now, because it's a religious text, it doesn't mean necessarily that it has no value for any other purpose. There's books I'm going to recommend on the archaeology of the Bible that shows that many of its narratives have significant historic core. And what I mean by historic core, that is that a narrative may have different conventions of language. It may have hyperbole, it may have mythological language, but they will still describe places within the narrative that are actually there. It still will describe cultural dynamics within its text that anthropologists and archaeologists have agreed that actually probably occurred. So when I talk about a historic core, there's a great deal of stories in the Bible that many will view with skepticism because they're fantastical, because they're miraculous, because they contain things that require faith to believe. But that doesn't mean that none of it has any factuality at all. And this is why the interpretation of the Bible becomes messy, because it's often in many cases, it can be sufficiently factually accurate for people to assert factuality about areas where it's veered into something fantastical. So this is where interpretation can get kind of weird. And that's why, and we'll talk about interpretation as well a little bit very soon in terms of interpreting an ancient text, because hermeneutics, this word hermeneutics, is the science and art of interpretation. And so when you're interpreting an ancient text, it's not enough just to say, what does it say? That's a translation issue. Translation tells you, what does the text say? Hermeneutics is, what does the text mean? And hermeneutics has to do with how you interpret a text to try to arrive at what an ancient or early or possibly original author might have meant when they said what they said. Why they used the words they did, why they used that syntax and that phrasing, why they used that literary style. But aside that, that's a different conversation. I want to get back to this idea of the Bible as a religious text, meaning that its primary purpose is to demonstrate or to show its readers things that they would not otherwise know. It is, by its nature, according to those who read it and follow it, and those who believe in its contents, the Bible is what's referred to as Revelation. Now, when I say Revelation, don't confuse that with the book of Revelation that's at the end of the New Testament. That full title of that little book is called The Revelation of Jesus Christ, or The Revelation of St. John. That's the full title. No, when I use the term revelation, I mean it's something that's revealed. In the generic sense, a revelation, a person has a revelation. That is something that's revealed that wouldn't otherwise be known. It's not available empirically, something that isn't available to the senses. It can't be grasped simply by the passive observer. It has to be revealed by another source. So, for example, when someone tells you a secret or someone tells you something you wouldn't otherwise know, they are revealing it to you. Oftentimes, I mean, think about the ways in which you use that term in normal society. People, now I see this all the time now, people are having children, and then when they're having children, they find out the sex of the child in utero, and then they have a gender reveal party where they reveal to everybody what they're about to have, a boy or a girl. So that's what I mean by revelation, is that many will view the sacred text as itself revelation. It's something revealed from God, something that you wouldn't otherwise know, whether it be the character of God, whether it be the requirements upon humankind. This is considered to be revelation. And within the contents of the Bible, that revelation takes the form of the different text and genre that you're encountering at the time, whether it's a historic style genre, like say with the book of Exodus, whether it's a legal type genre with the book of maybe Exodus or Leviticus or Deuteronomy, whether it's a poetic literary genre, like say with Job or Psalms or Proverbs, or it's a apocalyptic type of genre, or it's an epistolary genre, say in the New Testament. These are all different literary styles and ways in which that writing occurs, and therefore it has to be dealt with in that way. But it's all considered revelation, something that in the text, by means of the way that text behaves or the way the writers wrote, that all is somehow revelation from God, and it's all doing so in a different way, all with a different literary tactic, but it's all revelation. And that's how the devout, those who are in the religious system that believes in the God that's described, or the deities or the being or the spiritual reality that's described in that text, that's how they view it, as revelation. Well, think about this as being a religious text. Is revelation, but when I say that's religion, I mean that religion can be generically defined as a system of attitudes, beliefs, and practices for interacting with the supernatural or the divine within a given cultural community. So it's attitudes, beliefs, and practices. Some people try to differentiate, separate those out and say, well, religion, there's religion and rituals. Anthropologists will oftentimes try to separate those and say religion is, well, the religion is mental and the ritual is the physical manifestation of it. I get why they do that. I don't like to do that. Religion is all of it. It's what the people believe and what they do. And so it's a system of attitudes, beliefs, and practices for interacting with the spiritual, with the divine or supernatural through the defined by the parameters of a given culture community. People get to decide what is their religion. And sometimes people say, well, that's determined by elites, but not always. The archaeological record actually shows that at the popular level, at the level of the populace, people will engage in the religion in sometimes ways that aren't exactly the same as the elites are. So both people who have power and people who don't all show that they have religious adherence. Well, that religion will be manifested or demonstrated in what I call elements of the sacred. And these elements of the sacred is that they will manifest in things like sacred times, sacred space, sacred rites, sacred offices, sacred objects, and sacred myths. A myth is any story that is foundational to the belief system. And again, when anthropologists use the term myth, they don't necessarily mean that it's not factual. It just means that story has risen to the level of mythology. It's that important. So sacred space, I may not always give these in the same order when I say them. Sacred space, sacred times, sacred offices, sacred objects, sacred rites, and sacred myths. Now, all of those are demonstrated in the Bible, especially in areas that are describing the religion of the Old Testament that people engage in there. And you even see these throughout the creation account. You've already read the book of Genesis, or the first several chapters of Genesis, and already you're starting to see sacred times in terms of it describing the 6 days of creation, and then God rested on the seventh day. And you're seeing even sacred space with regard to the Garden of Eden, in which you have supposedly the primordial humankind has unobstructed access to God. And then you even see sacred rites in the terms of the early sacrifice systems that occur. But you haven't gotten into yet sacred offices and sacred objects. But all of those go into sacred myths also. All cultures have sacred myths. All cultures have their stories in which they describe the interaction with the deities. These can fall under creation myths. They can fall under distinction myths. They can fall under type of myths that make a people distinct, and how they journeyed through what they went through, or how they became a distinct people. These are all sorts of different myths that will be distinct to a culture. So all cultures have sacred myths, but they don't all have sacred text. That's what makes some of the major monotheisms especially unique. And you see it also throughout other religions that have a sacred text. But particularly like Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all have a sacred text. That changes the dynamics of how you have a sacred myth now, because once it becomes textualized, it becomes standardized. Now everyone else has to remember or read what is in the sacred text, and it also makes it even codified, where now people that actually keeps that sacred myth stationary, where now there's not freedom to just make it up as you go. In cultures where you don't have a sacred text, people who tell the sacred myths, especially creation myths, typically those are going to be people of some status, or it's going to be their cultural significance is the fact that they're telling it. And therefore they even have some freedom to even change the narrative of each generation. But when you have a sacred text, it's fixed as it is. So all those elements of the sacred are involved in a religion, and particularly religion described among the peoples of the Bible. So when it comes to the creation accounts wind up being a sacred myth that's within a sacred text that is all describing the religion that's going to unfold for these people. In fact, if as you continue to read through Genesis, you'll see that the creation myth is even a distinction myth. It winds up being something that shows the people of the Israelite people. It's specifically designed to show them to be a sacred people. So in essence, they hold sacred office because they can all travel. All the ancient Hebrews hold sacred office because they can track their lineage going back to Abraham and even back to Adam. So all these things tied together in making this a religious narrative. So as you're reading through Genesis and you're thinking about how sacred text works, we're going to be touching on this even more when we talk about the uses of a sacred text like this as a science book, and whether or not this is actually legitimate to try to use a sacred text like this to create the conflicts of Bible and modern science that we see today. We'll talk about this more even in hermeneutics a little bit later on. But right now I want you to get this idea in your head of how that religions work, these different sacred elements that function, and how a sacred myth, a creation myth, even functions within that religious framework. All right, so that's something for you to think about, and I'll follow up with more messages after this.